Remember the Star Wars bar in the movie Star
Yes,
Wars?
yes, yeah, I remember that.
That's your gut microbiome, and they look like those guys. They
Yeah,
really,
yeah.
they probably do under a microscope. That's what it is. And you know what? When there's no bad guys in the bar and everybody's having fun, everything works well. They all get along great. You remember the Star Wars bar? Everything's great. All of a sudden, you bring in some asshole from the whatever galaxy, and there goes the whole, the mood's gone. And, now their people are fighting and everything. And that's really a good analogy as to the gut microbiome.
Hello, I'm Robin Jeep with Enliven Foods, and this is World Changers Podcast, which introduces brilliant innovators who crack codes and provide solutions to improve human health. And today we have one such innovator, and this is John Hare from Winnipeg, Canada. And I'm going to let him tell you more about his background. He's a very unique individual, but he did get a degree in agriculture and he did his MBA, and he actually ran in federal politics in Canada. And he got his exposure to animal agriculture. We're not going to be talking as much about animal agriculture. We're going to talk about human health, but that's the background. But so he got his exposure to animal agriculture from his father's business, which was a distribution company for for agricultural products. And with that, I'm just going to let John get started and let John tell you a little bit about himself and his background. Hello, John. Welcome.
Hi, Robin. Thanks for having me on. And I appreciate the name of your podcast, where you have brilliant innovators. And so I that's probably the first time I've ever been considered brilliant. So I'll take it. But anyway, yeah, no, and my background is animal agriculture. That's where I spent a lot of time. And my customers in that business, typically we were distributing products to the animal feed industry. And so, a lot of people probably don't realize that the nutrition that food production animals get is unbelievably fine. It's sort of perfect nutrition, and the reason being is that the farmer needs to get his animals to market as fast as possible. So they can't. They need the best nutrition, so they'll grow as fast as they can possibly grow, and they also need whatever treatments that will prevent them from getting sick as they're trying to get to market. So, what my job was.
Also, I want to say one thing. They also don't have the opportunity to eat addictive processed foods.
Well, that's one thing that's very interesting, that's different from humans to animals. And Robin and I were discussing that previously, is that in animal health and the drugs that treat food production animals, I like to say there's no what you call superfluous drugs. In other words, the treatments that a farmer is going to give his animals are absolutely necessary to get that animal as healthy as possible to the finish line, which is when they're going to be marketable as fast as possible. So there really isn't anything that's not necessary that's going into an animal that is going to make them healthy and grow fast, get them to market. So that's the goal, in animal agriculture. And so contrast that to human health, where let's face it, we do things and we treat ourselves with the idea that we're going to make ourselves healthier. I think in the North American healthcare system, that may not necessarily be the goal. And, let's face it, we're right now suggesting that we probably have the least healthy population of pretty much, all countries in the world. So a big difference between animals and humans. And, but the nice thing about on the animal side is you can learn a lot. And that was a great way for me to learn, first of all, about digestive systems, which is really what we've got ourselves into, of late. But you can also do experiments with animals that you couldn't do with humans. There's a lot of observational benefits with working with animals. You can see results quickly. With a baby pig, for example, they're not on this. They're going from birth to market weight in a very short period, probably 5 months. And, a lot of people wouldn't believe that that's actually the case. And so you've got a pretty short lifespan that you can actually see the results of a lot of different trials and experiments. And so, how we got onto these antibodies, which is what we're going to be talking about with Robin, is I was dealing with my customers who are nutritionists. In other words, these are the people that feed these animals. And I'm not kidding you. The nutrition they get and the diets they get are very, very precise. As a matter of fact, you can get, you know, a baby pig right to their final market weight. They would probably have 6 or 7 different diets over that period of time. In matter of fact, you know, once they've been weaned after about 3 weeks after they're born, that first probably 3 or 4 weeks, they'll have 2 or 3 or 4 different diets in that period of time. So very finite and precision nutrition. And, you know, the whole idea is to get them to market as fast as possible. And part of that is making sure they don't get sick. And for the longest time, and this was a big problem from the point of view of what they call antimicrobial resistance, all farm food production animals were getting antibiotics. And you think about, my God, you know, they didn't need antibiotics, but they were getting them because it was basically a way of preventing them from getting sick. So if you think you've got a herd of animals, you know, 100,000 animals, maybe 5% would have gotten sick and needed the antibiotics, but you treat them all so that none of them get sick, and now they get to market a whole lot faster. But just think what that does from the point of view of those antibiotics basically wearing out. In other words, you know, the bacteria that they're trying to protect us from are mutating to the point where they're going to, you know, not that those antibiotics won't be effective anymore. And by the way, those are the same antibiotics basically that we use for human infections as well. So we came up with the antibodies, and that was basically from some research.
Wait, I want just a minute, John, because I want to follow this outline because it kind of
Okay,
going
yeah,
here.
yeah, go ahead.
So let's talk first about, and I do want to say to everybody, I am a vegan. I don't like that all of these things are happening to these animals. Of course, it's disturbing for me, but I can see the benefits that have come out of this and how important this is for human health. And so this is why I'm showing this to you all, so you all can understand really what's going on and how some of these things work. So let's talk about antimicrobial resistance. Can you explain to folks about, because that's going to play in here with the antibiotics and everything?
Yeah, no, and basically, I think a lot of people have heard of antimicrobial resistance, AMR in short. Basically, what's happening is we haven't had any new antibiotics being produced for a long, long time. Matter of fact, it wasn't that long ago, you know, that penicillin was first invented, and that was back in the 1920s. Didn't really get into commercial use until the Second World War. So we've really only had the antibiotics that we've now used to treat bacterial infections, and that has to be, you know, make sure that you understand that bacterial infections are what antibiotics work against. And that's only been since, like I say, the Second World War, and they've been great. And let's face it, when, you know, and the war was probably the best proving grounds, because, you know, a lot of the people on the front lines, they didn't die of gunshot wounds. They died of the infections that they got after, you know, they were wounded. And then obviously with the advent of penicillin, that stopped a lot of that, which was, you know, a great invention. Biggest problem is that, you know, antibiotics are just like a rat poison for a bug, which is you know, a bacteria. And, you know, the just like in natural selection, those bugs eventually evolve to not be affected by those antibiotics anymore. And so that's what the resistance is about. In other words, the bacteria will modify themselves to not be, they don't get killed by those antibiotics anymore. And so really the whole thing is, we now know about antibiotic resistance. The trouble is there's not a lot being done other than a lot of talk to counteract it. In other words, we have a lot of meetings, a lot of bureaucrats go to meetings every year, and they talk to governments, and we have to do something about this because they say by 2050, the number of deaths caused by a bacterial infection will exceed what now are the main causes, which is cancer and heart disease, for, you know, the human population. They're saying probably 10 million people a year will die from a cut on your finger. And, you know, I use the example, you're going to go into your doctor and you got a little cut on your finger, and he's going to look at it and say, yeah, you've got probably 2 weeks to live. And you're thinking, whoa. Well, and that's not an exaggeration, because if we do not develop new antibiotics or something, doesn't have to be antibiotics necessarily, and our antibodies are an alternative as well, we're going to have that kind of a problem. So.
Okay, well, with that, let's talk about, I want to just, so John has developed some egg antibodies. They're from eggs, and they are pretty harmless to the body, but they protect us because we have antibodies ourselves. So they're just like our antibodies, it's just extra antibodies. So now that you've got the antimicrobial resistance to antibiotics, let's tell people the difference between, a lot of people know because with COVID, they learned a lot about antibodies, but let's just make sure and talk about what an antibody is now, because it has nothing, it's not an antibiotic in any way, shape, or form.
No. As a matter of fact, it was interesting. I've been working on this technology since 1997. And as much as COVID was bad, what it did do was wake people up to the word antibodies. I think after COVID, everybody knew about antibodies because you had to get the vaccine to get the antibodies generated to prevent you from getting sick from the virus, which whether or not that worked is another question altogether. Antibodies are what your body produces naturally to fight off infections. So since the dawn of mankind, what's kept us alive is our immune system that produces antibodies that fights off infections that we get, any bacterial infections, any viral infections, things that are not recognized as normal to the human body. So even a sliver that you get from a piece of wood would literally be attacked by, you'd get an inflammation, which is basically antibodies going to the area where you had the sliver, which would then cause an infection otherwise. And so antibodies are a natural produced thing by an immune system. And typically we think of our own immune system with the idea of getting a vaccine. That vaccine is supposed to stimulate your immune system to let you think you've got whatever you're being vaccinated against. And so your immune system produces antibodies that are now available for you, and they'll last for a period of time. In case you come in contact with that pathogen, be it a virus or a bacteria, you'll have the antibodies that will prevent you from getting sick from that pathogen. So that's what antibodies are.
Okay, so we're going to go deeper into John's what the antibodies that he's developed, but let's just when we all learned about antibodies, everybody was learning about antibodies. That was when COVID came out, and at that time they came out with this COVID vaccine, which was under emergency use authorization, and that's how they were able to develop it quickly and not have to do all of the different studies, and they were able to get it pretty much all over the world. And during that time, didn't Big Pharma double their revenue when they came out with that vaccine?
Well, there's no question that COVID was a great way for pharma to basically take advantage of the situation. And I don't know if we want to get into the clout that pharma has with not only the regulatory boards but with politicians and all the rest. But they obviously saw a great opportunity. And let's face it, you have to remember. And I was thinking about it. If you're a patient in the American healthcare system, you have to be careful because the American healthcare system is incentivized to make money. And is that actually good for the patient? And that's something that all patients.
It's a for-profit system, whereas your system in Canada, it doesn't behoove anybody in your system in Canada for people to be sick, whereas it does in our system in the United States. Is that correct?
To a certain degree, and I'm not going to say one system is better than the other, but the biggest problem is you've got to have checks and balances in any case. And okay, in the United States system where it's for profit, people try to max profit. Here we try to lower costs. So both cases are going to be bad for the patient. You know what I'm saying? So we're going to not give, because we're trying to save costs in Canada, we're not going to give certain things that probably should be given because they're too expensive. Down there, you're going to give more to get more profit. And so either one, I'm not saying which one's better or which one will work, but all I'm saying is that the individual patient has to be conscious always, and not just a patient going into a hospital. Any drug you take, you should be thinking about, is this for my benefit? Is it for the benefit of the person selling it to me? And when you mentioned COVID, the fact that Pfizer doubled their revenue in 1 year. So Pfizer's a huge company doing $50 billion a year in sales. The next year when COVID hit, they did 100 billion. So, pretty incredible to be for any company to double their revenue, especially when you're that big already, just on one thing. I mean, their revenues fell right back again when COVID vaccine obviously wasn't being used to it. But think about it. It's not only a virus that people were afraid of, maybe rightfully or not rightfully, but it was now being mandated for vaccines, which what a great deal for anybody that's going to be selling something. If you could mandate it to every person on the planet,
yeah, that's
what a great thing.
before.
And the biggest problem is that this is why I'm trying to say patient beware always. And I'm not going to say yay, nay, or otherwise to the vaccine, whether it was good or bad. I personally didn't get it. We make vaccines. That's one of our things. And so I've known about the mRNA vaccine for a long time, never been used anywhere before, ever, on animals or humans before it was used in that COVID situation. So, a little bit, I'm leery because I know about vaccines to a certain degree because we make them. But, to me, beware always for any drugs you're taking, any procedures you're going to get, and think about, is it to your benefit? I love the healthcare system and the fact that I've had things that I couldn't fix. I've had 3 hernias that, they just happened. And so I had to have the surgeries, no question about it, because they wouldn't fix themselves. In other cases, I don't take any medications otherwise at all. No blood pressure meds, no statin drugs or anything like that. And so, I'm 74 now. And so, but, obviously you've got to take care of your own health otherwise. But, I think that, the main message really is, patient beware. It's usually buyer beware. And and that's a little bit of one of the biggest problems with the healthcare system in general is you've got to be wary of where the treatments that are coming at you, are they coming for your benefit or for the benefit of the
And you've got to be educated. You have to educate yourself. Well, I just remember with the COVID vaccination, and I'm going somewhere with this. It was they rejected any other safe and effective treatments to protect that EUA, because the only way that you can keep an EUA is there can't be any other treatments. And at that time, which I've interviewed her also, Dr. Hazen, she had developed the treatment that a lot of people were using, which was the high dose vitamin C, doxycycline, ivermectin, and then I think also the hydrochloroquine. She had developed those, and by the way, she didn't lose one single patient to COVID using that. And the FDA, she was being supported to research this, and then the FDA pulled it because it would have been something that could have affected this EUA. And then do you remember when the monoclonal antibodies were used to treat the COVID?
Oh yeah, and that was interesting because, as a matter of fact, I credit Ron DeSantis down in Florida because he got onto that quickly, and he let's face it, Florida was the free state. As a matter of fact, I spent the winter of 21-22 in Florida because of my vaccine status was not related.
Right.
But what was interesting is so those monoclonal antibodies. As a matter of fact, people will maybe remember that Donald Trump got, when he was just about going out in 2020, when before the next election, he got COVID.
Oh, that's right.
And they gave him the monoclonal
antibodies, and he got over it. Well, my sister got COVID, and she went and they gave her the monoclonal antibodies, and she was like, "This was fantastic. I came home and I was well."
Well,
and they were having. And they pulled them.
Well, no, and I'll tell you the story that was interesting there. Here's what really, they didn't really pull them. They made them available. So the monoclonal antibodies, let's face it, the monoclonal antibodies made by somebody as well, another pharma company. They were making money, so they were happy. They didn't pull them, but they made them available to everybody. But the guy who got onto it was Ron DeSantis. And he said, okay, we're not going to mandate vaccines down here. But by the way, we've got these monoclonal antibodies. So what he did is he set up, I think, about 30 different stations, and you can do about in one of those facilities, you can do, and monoclonal antibodies are an infusion. You've got to go in and hook yourself up to an IV for about an hour. So it's not a quick bang shot and you're out of there. So but he set up, I think, 30 around the state of Florida of these locations where if you, and it had to be within 7 days. In other words, you got
Right. You had to do
diagnosed
it.
with COVID. Within the first 7 days of that diagnosis, you had to get
Yes.
the monoclonal or they wouldn't give it to you. So he set up these 30 stations, and he was the only governor that sort of caught on to this whole thing. So all of the all of the monoclonal antibodies that were being paid for by the federal government were going to Florida. And let's face it, at that time, you've got Biden in charge, and he's a Democrat, and you've got DeSantis, who's a Republican. And I think really the reason they pulled it is that Florida was getting it all, and it's expensive. Those
Oh,
monoclonal treatments are like minimum 4 or 5 grand per treatment.
yeah,
So,
but my sister's insurance paid for it.
well, that's fine. That's fine
Covered with
because,
insurance.
but no, they would probably wouldn't have had to because the government was going to pay for it
But
anyway.
that was early on. I don't know what happened later. I just know they weren't available later.
Well,
And
because the only guy who was using it was DeSantis, and he's the enemy, remember? He's
right.
not mandating vaccines, and what he's doing is he's taking the benefit. And so he was grabbing all because nobody else took them. Nobody other
Because they
governors.
worked. It was
They were
effective.
they were great. Antibodies work very well if you, as long as you get them in the right period of time. And so now he all of us, and during that period, now they recognize that this is not working for us because Ron DeSantis, the bad guy who's not complying with our mandates, is getting all the monoclonals, and so he's getting the benefit of the monoclonals, and at the expense of not having to mandate the vaccine. So it was interesting, and I just laughed when I saw that because they literally said, oh well, we're not going to supply Florida with any more because they're taking more than their share. Nobody else wanted it, and it was there. It was being made available. It was being paid for by the government, the same as the vaccines were. Anyway, but it was politically incorrect, of course.
Yeah,
So
well, we could go into reverse what was it? Reversal. What was that with that drug that drug that was so dangerous that they were giving people for COVID?
yeah, yeah, it's I can't
Remdesivir.
remember. Yeah,
I don't even want to go into that. So
yeah.
anyway, let's talk about, so we've talked about antibodies. We brought in the COVID and the monoclonal antibodies. And so it seems that in our increasingly toxic world, because we've got, I mean, we have things that human beings are being exposed to chemicals they've never been exposed to before, and bacteria mutated different strains of bacteria that were never intended to even happen. And so just for an example, we've got a lot of contaminated from factory contamination from factory farming. We've got runoff E. coli pollution. We've got E. coli in meat processing, you know, all the recalls and everything we have all the time. E. coli contamination from biosolids, crop fertilization. Consequently, E. coli ends up on your vegetables. It's not the vegetables' fault. They're being contaminated from the irresponsible use of the biosolids, the manure, the meat processing stuff, and the resistant E. coli. And so it ends up mutating, becoming more resistant, and then a more virulent E. coli. And we have a big problem in the United States. We process a lot of meat, a whole lot of meat. And that waste has to go somewhere. And the reason I've researched this because we had to stop it, a whole group of us here in this area, because we had two lagoons that they opened near us where they were putting all the meat packing processing solids in the lagoons, and they were spreading it, paying farmers up to $7,000 an acre to just spread it on their land. And it was making everybody sick, and it was causing real estate the values to drop. So I got very involved in this, and I learned that we have such a problem because we talk to waste disposal people and so forth. We have such a problem with the disposal of this waste, these massive quantities of waste, because you have to keep in mind, we don't just process meat for the United States. We process meat for other countries as well. And so there's a responsible way to process this bio waste, and that is they have to heat it to a very high temperature, and then they put it in landfills, but that's very expensive. And so one of the ways in states, and our state was one of them that allowed them to do it, and it still has to be fought all the time, is these companies will go to the waste processing plant, and they will be paid a lot of money to haul off this waste. And then what they do with it, that's their business. So they go and they put it in these lagoons, and then they put it in trucks, and they go spread it on farmland. And they're doing this throughout the United States, until people stand, it's just intolerable. The stench is, and
Well,
it makes you sick. It literally
when
makes you.
when you say the waste from meat packing, typically the non-usable meat from a slaughtered animal will go into a rendering process. So in other words, they literally boil it down into,
Well, that's the usable stuff. This is the unusable stuff.
well, I just wonder what that is. In other words, there's a lot
That's
of waste. There's okay, you know, dung is one of the biggest. Let's face it.
there's blood, there are things that I can't remember all there are chemicals they use to clean the place.
Oh yeah,
There's
there's no question.
so when you clean up where they've slaughtered an animal and processed an animal, there's stuff on the floor, there's junk. And so that's the stuff that ends up, they put it in these fermentation tanks, which are just open pits, and let it ferment. And you can imagine the stench, because it's also mixed with chemicals.
Yeah.
And
Well,
the
you
stench is,
go buy a
it,
rendering plant and
it,
things like that too.
it burns when you inhale it. It burns all the way down when you inhale it. So anyway, these are the things, these are just some of the things. Then we've got air pollution. We've got, there are all kinds of pollutants coming at us that we've never before. We've got, chemical pesticide, all this stuff is just coming at us, human beings were never designed for this, to be subject to this. And so what I'm saying is we need some help. Human beings need some help to stay upright and functioning and healthy. And that's one of the reasons I recommend, the whole food plant-based diet, because that is a detoxification diet. Those plant foods help your body to detoxify and be more efficient in detoxification, which we definitely need right now. But even that is not always enough. And then some people get sick, and then the diet is not enough. They need some more help to get back on their feet again. And so basically, poor diet, toxic environments wreaking havoc on our immune systems, and many people are sick. Do you know, John, I just did an AI search on this, of how many people in the United States are suffering from GI health issues? What percentage?
Yeah, it's a lot. There's no question.
It's 61% of
Yeah.
that's reported GI health issues. Those are not the people silently suffering.
Yeah. Well,
61%.
and I think that, if you go back 2,400 years, in Hippocrates, his comment was all disease begins in the gut. And that's GI diseases. And so you're absolutely right. When you think about 61% of the people have GI problems, but think about what that can lead to. The GI problems might just be the start.
It leads to everything. It leads to cancer. It leads because the GI problem means immunity problem. I mean, you can't, if you have GI problems, you have an immunity problem.
Well,
So if
partially.
you have an immunity problem, you're subject to cancer, even heart disease, all kinds of things.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you're right. It's an immune problem, but part of the immune problem is, and this is what research has shown now, is that the gut microbiome, and people have to think about that. That's something that, if you think about all the diseases that you get over your lifetime, when you're born, your genetics are set. So your genetics are not going to change. You might get in diseases that are genetically you're prone to, and there's certain things that are that, like cystic fibrosis, for example, or is caused by, by two parents that shouldn't have been having kids and that kind of thing. So there are some genetic inherited, diseases, but for the most part, somebody gets asthma when they're 16. Now, their genetics didn't change, and I don't care if their parents had asthma or not. Most people aren't predisposed to asthma because of the genetics. Something else changed, and so and in anything you get, so you think, okay. And this is one of the problems with the healthcare system as we see it right now. You'll go in and say, Doc, I've got, all of a sudden this is happening to me, whatever it is, my left leg hurts or whatever. I don't care what it is. And the doc says, oh, your left leg hurts. It's probably this. We'll give you this for the symptom and make it better. why wouldn't he ask, well, what did you do that might have caused that? Did you eat something different? Were you out in a field where they were spraying chemicals and that might have affected you? Because my argument is most diseases, and I go back 2,400 years, and I think Hippocrates is right, and I can relate that, by the way, to animal agriculture, and I'll tell you that in a second. But if all disease begins in the gut, so now you sort of think about, well, what did I eat? What did I get exposed to? Can I change that? Can I reverse that? To instead of just dealing with symptoms, which, let's face it, symptoms are great for the healthcare industry because you can treat them forever. Curing them from those symptoms is another thing altogether, because that's not good for the healthcare industry in general, because they need patients, they need sick people. So, when I say about the animal agriculture, from the point of view of of Hippocrates, a farmer, and I've been in many, many barns, that was my business. And so what a farmer does, he can't talk to his patients, which are his pigs and chickens and cows. So what he watches for, the first thing he watches for always, is diarrhea. And if that doesn't subside within 2 days, then he calls in the vet because something's going on. So there, that really authenticates, Hippocrates' statement that all disease, the farmer has no other recourse but to say, okay, this diarrhea is lasting longer than it should. There's something more than just he ate something and it's not passing through the right way. And again, we see that all the time. And even with the point of, you mentioned E. coli a few times, we have antibodies. Okay, so getting around to what I do now, we actually sell antibodies, oral dose antibodies, really the first in the world that have been recognized as an actual treatment. So those oral dose antibodies basically go into your gut and can manipulate the gut microbiome. So, for example, we can have an antibody against E. coli. If you have a high level of E. coli in your gut, it will knock that down. It will, suppress the E. coli. Matter of fact, works great if you got traveler's diarrhea, and typically caused by E. coli in third world countries. You take these antibodies, and within an hour or so, you're better, which is way better than waiting for your own immune system to produce antibodies, which takes 5 or 6 days. So,
Yeah.
so that's sort of how antibodies work. But the whole idea of the gut microbiome, there's now research. You can go online and you can Google, or AI. It's now with it, Google sort of out of it in the past, but put in any disease you have, or anything that, asthma, arthritis, doesn't matter, and then look for research associated with that, with the gut microbiome. So Google asthma gut microbiome, and you'll get research that all kinds of people are looking at. What's the association with what they call a dysbiosis? In other words, the bugs in your gut are not happy, and that, how is that dysbiosis associated with whatever the chronic disease is? And so, an interesting thing is this whole gut microbiome, and there hasn't been really anything that is specifically able to target those bugs. Yes, we have antibiotics which take out bacteria. Problem with antibiotics is they're not specific. They're broad spectrum. You take an antibiotic and it knocks out your whole gut flora. Well, now you're in worse shape. So, and that's, by the way, how we got into the C. diff. One of the things that's interesting, and I don't know if any of your viewers have ever heard of a thing called fecal microbiota transplant, FMT.
I'm sure some have.
Yeah, and it's an interesting treatment, and it's been around, surprising enough, for a long time. Not officially, but they had what they called, I think, in Chinese medicine years, thousands of years ago, green soup, which was basically taking feces from a healthy patient and feeding it to an unhealthy patient, and virtually a fecal transplant, or FMT as they call it, fecal microbiota transplant, is taking the poop of a healthy patient and getting it into the gut of an unhealthy patient. And the main unhealthy patient is somebody that has shown with what they call C. difficile bacteria, which is one of the bacteria we're talking about. So, and it works as an actual treatment, but from the point of view of pharma and FDA, it's hard to regulate that, because everybody's poop that is the healthy donor is different. And so, one thing about the FDA and approving drugs, they like to approve a drug that is going to be consistently the same every time. which
yeah, it's more
you can't do
synthetic.
that.
Well,
So
one of the things I want to give you a couple of adages for something you said is that this is from Caldwell Esselstyn. He's a doctor. Genetics load the gun and environment pulls the trigger. So you might have some genetics for something, but if you don't get subjected to certain environmental conditions, it never shows up.
no, and that's true, and that's why basically you're right, because let's face it, say we got somebody spraying. I have a field out in the back that I'm looking at, and says, if a farmer's out there spraying chemicals, the two of us could walk out there, and your genetics would make you susceptible.
That's
Where mine
right.
would. So there's no question.
Okay.
Everybody individually is different, but I think you're absolutely right. It's the environment that triggers. So
Yeah, yeah. So genetics loads the gun, environment pulls the trigger. And then another one is, when you're driving your car and your check engine light comes on, and to immediately go to the mechanic to find out what's going on. And so far most of the pharmaceuticals these days are like this. So you go to the mechanic, he looks at it, and he goes and he disconnects that wire that causes the engine light warning to come on. And he disconnects it so that you won't be warned anymore. And he says, I fixed it. And you go off and the engine light's not coming on anymore.
yeah, it's funny you should mention that. I've been
Oh,
driving
and then everything your car falls apart.
yeah. You want to trust your mechanics. By the way, you want to trust your doctors as well.
That's
Not much
true.
different. So, let's hope that the mechanic will, you can go to other mechanics after your car blows up when he told you the thing was fixed. You won't be using him again. So,
Right.
the unfortunate part on the human, you use the analogy on humans, you might die if you got the wrong treatments otherwise. And so, one thing for a car to explode or the engine to fall out, a different thing if you get the wrong. And by the way, now they're saying that the third largest cause of death in the United States is something going wrong with medicines or the healthcare system. In other words, the treatments are actually killing people. And
Well,
now the third largest cause of death in the U.S. So again,
I just got a call this morning. Speaking of this, I got a call from a friend, and her daughter takes thyroxine, which is for the thyroid. She has the hypothyroid, and she was having pain, and so she went to the doctor. Her doctor was not there. She called her doctor. Her doctor was not in, so they let her talk to another doctor. Or she called in and she said she needed something. She has a bulging disc in her back and she needed something for the pain. So they called something in. She went to the pharmacy to pick it up. They have all her medical records there. And she took it. It was some kind of muscle relaxer. She took it and she started feeling really weird, like really strange, like something's very wrong. And told her mother, and her mother looked it up, or she looked it up on AI. And there can be a bad cross reaction with thyroxine, and she takes thyroxine, and it can even cause death. And she's looking at this and she's feeling horrible, and she finally just kind of passes out and goes to sleep, and then she wakes up feeling better. But the doctor, her records were there that she took thyroxine, but that doctor obviously didn't look at her records, because they're doing a lot, and you have to, and there's so many drugs now that you need to have. A lot of them will have a little iPad, and they'll put the drug in and then look for all the interactions with other drugs. But this girl could have died, and I don't blame the doctor. I really don't. It's too much. It's too much to be able to keep up with all these different drugs and what can interact with this herb or this other drug or this food. Or it's just, when a person's taking 15 drugs, how do you keep up with all of that?
well, like I said, take no drugs. That's the best
Right,
way.
like me, I don't take any drugs.
Neither do I. And so, and by the way, I have this little statement. The goal of the healthcare industry should be to put itself out of business. In other words, we should
Yes.
make everybody better to the point where we don't need that anymore. But guess what? I know that they've got Maha going on in the States and they're trying to make America healthy again. But man, if you made America healthy again, you'd have the biggest unemployment problem you could ever imagine. The fastest growing industry in the United States is healthcare, and it's the largest employer is health.
I didn't think about that, but you're absolutely right.
So it's a balancing act. Yeah,
But
we
then you
cured
would also
everybody,
have
but
all these people that are on disability start flooding the market. They
we,
could start working again.
well, that double whammy. You'd have
Right.
all the healthcare people would be unemployed. All the sick people would be now employable. So you'd have double the unemployment. And so, so the poor president is going to get unelected because unemployment rates are 25%. So anyway, you can't win. It's really what the
I
problem.
know it. I know it. I know it. Well, let's go into your products, what you've created, what you've come up with, and how effective it is, how it got, it was developed for the pigs, and kind of the whole history of it, and what you've seen, and the research trials, and your anecdotal evidence, your website, all that stuff. Let's go into that now. I'll let you just
Okay,
take it
well,
from.
and as I said, back, my business was dealing with nutritionists, and we had they call it a nutrition conference, and they bring in speakers for these conferences, and all my customers are in one location, which is kind of nice. I don't have to travel all over the country to try to find them, and so they bring in all of them, and then they'll bring in educational people, that can. We're doing research on this and this, and so one of the research at one of these meetings was doing this egg antibody technology. And basically what that is, and it's, in the most rudimentary way of putting it, you pick a target. Okay, so we're going to say E. coli. Now you get a chicken and you develop a vaccine against E. coli. So we have a lab here in Winnipeg that's a government certified lab to produce vaccines, not for vaccinating humans, but for vaccinating chickens. So what we do is we vaccinate the chicken, stimulate that immune system, no different than if you got a
Wait, I
vaccine.
want to ask you, so this vaccine, is that like a dead
Yeah,
E.
it's what you call the traditional vaccine. It's not an mRNA vaccine. So it's and I don't attenuated. I'm not exactly sure on the
Yeah,
different. But
it's a
yeah,
dead
and by
bacteria.
the way, just for us to get that vaccine approved to treat a chicken, not for the chicken's own health, but so we didn't kill the chicken. And a chicken only lives, a layer hen lives probably productively about 14 months anyway. So it took us 4 years to get approval for our vaccine to not harm that chicken. Whereas COVID was approved, the COVID vaccines were approved in what, less than 9 months?
Yeah.
So how did they ever come up with the safety? We're just trying to protect chickens from dying. They only live 14 months, and we had to take 4 years to prove that we weren't harming them. Meanwhile, humans who are getting this COVID vaccine that hasn't been really tried for anything as far as the downside side effects, they got that done in a very short order. I mean, great that they could move things fast, but move things fast and not safely is another story. Anyway, back to our story. I learned about this technology, and I actually partnered with that professor for a short period of time. And then we eventually developed. It's one thing in the lab to inject a couple of chickens with a vaccine against E. coli, use the chicken's immune system. Basically, the chicken is our actual bioreactor. So the chicken will now produce those antibodies, and as a natural passive immunity, humans do it. All vertebrate animals pass on immunity to their offspring. And how a chicken does it, a layer hen, is they pass those antibodies into the egg. So now that egg, if it's fertilized, obviously now that those antibodies will be available to the chick as it grows in the egg and then hatches, and now it's got mother's antibodies. Obviously in an unfertilized egg, those antibodies are still there. So we take the eggs, we process them. Everything is proprietary. How we do it is, we've learned a lot as to what you do and what you don't do. And so anyway, now we have eggs with antibodies in them. So now we got part of the processing is making it into a powder form, because one thing about eggs, they're good for maybe 30 days, and after that they go bad. So the nice thing about putting them into a powder form, they literally will, matter of fact, a dried egg can last for 25 years. So from that perspective, it's great. It's, from a medical point of view, really good. And the fact that one of the things about vaccines, which was, the COVID vaccine, they had to be stored, cold storage. You couldn't just, ship them, so there's the technicalities of our product are way lower than most vaccines. And the other thing about what we do is, okay, if you think about a vaccine in a human, you're going to vaccinate everybody. Now, everybody's reaction to that vaccine is going to be different. You know, a healthy person will produce a good immune response. An unhealthy person probably won't. And I use the phrase that a vaccine's only as good as the immune system of the person receiving it. So you don't know what you're going to get when you get vaccinated. You know, and matter of fact, even that you could be a healthy person and the vaccine doesn't react well with you to the point where you don't get the antibody results that you wanted, whereas an unhealthy person might get a better reaction. So you really don't know. One thing about our antibodies, we know when we get those antibodies, the titer level of them, we know the longevity of them. So we know that you're going to get the same dose of antibodies every time, which that is better than a vaccine. And the fact that you at least know, if we have to go through trials obviously to show it, but we need 2 eggs worth of antibody to cure C. difficile infection, for example. That's just it's powder form, obviously, but that's the way it works. And we know from trials with multiple people that this is the dose that is right. So you're not counting on your own immune system. We've already let that job up to the chicken, and we can screen those antibodies, and if they're not high enough, we don't use them. So that's the nice thing about that antibody treatment as opposed to a vaccine treatment. And one of the things we did during COVID, as a matter of fact, we made a pitch to our government, and the Canadian government at the time, and everybody was scrambling around trying to figure out what can we do to solve this major problem that turned out to be not as major as everybody thought it was, but it was a great scare tactic. But we're going to give $1 billion to Canadian companies that can come up with something that can mitigate the problems of COVID. Well, most our companies we came up with, we can make a mask, we can do hand sanitizer, we can do this and this. You know, it's like no innovation whatsoever. So we at the time, and I, you know, it's subsequently been proven by a bunch of people who've done work after, we made the proposal that we can get antibodies. If the goal is antibodies, let's face it, that was what everyone's talking about. Once we've got the vaccine, we'll have the antibodies. Or once you get infected, you'll have the antibodies yourself naturally, which didn't get counted, by the way, as far as you still need to be vaccinated, which really made no sense. But if the word is antibodies, well, why couldn't we produce antibodies, purify them from the egg, and now do an oral dose? Like, in other words, by the way, there's 2 places you get sick with COVID. You have to have receptors. You could have the COVID virus all over your arm and it wouldn't bother you at all. If you inhaled it, you have receptors in your upper respiratory system, and those receptors are required for COVID to attach. You also have those receptors in your gut. So we made the proposal that we could do an oral dose antibody for your gut receptors, and we could do an aerosol antibody, you know, that you would spray into your upper respiratory system. And you would take it only, okay, I want to go to a football game and I'm going to be surrounded by a bunch of people. We could test and say, okay, we think that our antibodies will last 6 hours, and you can check that. In other words, so now I'm going to the football game, which only lasting 3 hours. I'll do my oral dose, take the stuff for my gut receptors, take the aerosol spray for my nasal receptors, and now you're protected, and literally protected, because you know it. We can measure, you know, okay, this person was treated with this, they were exposed to whatever, and it didn't work, or it did work. And so you can learn that. Whereas, you know, a systemic antibody traveling around in your body, how do you know that's going to protect you or not? You don't. And so you know, they tell you it will, but in our case, it's like a shield. The antibody's there already when the virus hits. Well, if it can't get into the receptors because the antibody's already knocking it out. And by the way, there's been a bunch of research since then that have shown, we got rejected, of course. You know, we weren't big pharma, and we weren't, you know, the narrative. And so we didn't obviously get any funding to go ahead with it. But there's been a bunch of research since that has said, and I've got it on our website, that showing the research that other places have done. University of California in Davis, you know, did a bunch of work on the egg antibodies and said, yeah, this would have worked great. But you know, it's not big pharma, and so it's almost like the ivermectin that didn't get any traction either. So, but that's how antibodies work, which, you know, they protect you, and if you can know what those antibodies are beforehand, in other words, you know that what you're getting is legitimate titer level strength of antibodies versus a vaccine that you don't know how it's going to react with your own immune system. So that's that.
Do you have this product? Have you made this product?
No, we never went forward with it. I mean, the one thing about doing any of these things, it takes a lot of work to do it. I mean, even our E. coli antibody, I mean, we developed that antibody back around 2000, and it's an interesting story, and it was for baby pigs. So the millennial was just happening, and everything was talking about remember where the world was going to end if things didn't work the way they should on the switch over from 1999
Right.
to 2000.
I
and,
remember.
and so we called our product PEP, Panacea Egg Powder 2000. And our very first customer, we had a little bag of white powder. Well, it's yellow powder because it's egg powder, and we sent it to a feed mill down in Ontario, which is a time zone east of us, and they put it into, well, as a matter of fact, the farmer, we sent it right to the farmer. He took it. He's got an unlabeled bag of egg powder. So he took it to his own feed mill, and they said, we're not putting that in anything. It's going to contaminate our whole mill. Anyway, so he went to another feed mixer, and the guy, now this feed mixer got potential to get a new customer, and they were a smaller company anyway, and say, yeah, we'll try it. So anyway, they mixed it up, put it in his feed. Anyway, the guy came back, and we were calling it PEP 2000. And his comment, this is the very first customer we ever dealt with on the animal side. He said, you got to change your name. It shouldn't be PEP 2000. You should call it Miracle. I'm thinking, oh, okay. And it won't make any sense to most people, except if you're in the industry. But we brought his mortality rate. So when baby pigs are born, they get a high mortality rate. And out of 100 pigs, you'll lose 6 of them, just because they need something to keep them to boost them. His mortality went from 6% to 1. So in other words, he was losing 6 pigs per 100. Now he's losing 1. And to him, that was a miracle. And so that was his way. By the way, we've had that miracle term used a few times, on the human side as well. But anyway, so we started that in 2000. We didn't get our registration as an actual veterinary biologic until the end of 2007. So that was the process. It takes, we were selling the product with a wink and a nod as egg powder, very expensive egg powder, because it was doing a job that the farmers knew what it was, but we didn't make any claims on any labels or anything like that. Matter of fact, that first guy didn't have a label at all, but it worked great. And that was one of the things we knew, and we knew it was going to. I mean, we'd seen, the research, we'd done lots of research before we gave it to anybody, of course. And so, but it took that long to get the actual veterinary biologic registration. And now, even with the C. difficile one that we're working on the human side, the bureaucracy involved is incredible to try to bring a new treatment to market, especially a new treatment that is unknown to standard medical practice, and so that's part of the hurdles we're going through right now.
Well, let's talk about, first I want to talk about the C. diff treatment and the trials and sort of where you are on that. And then we'll go into the gut fix, which is a product that you already have out there for sale. So let's talk about the C. diff.
Well, and C. diff, again, we talked about it a little bit. Unfortunately, not many people know about C. difficile infection. As a matter of fact, there was a study that was done by one of the digestive organizations, the Digestive Health Organization or whatever, and they actually interviewed C. difficile recovered patients. And one of the questions was, what was your biggest complaint about C. diff in general? And almost every one of them answered not knowing about it. In other words, I went into the hospital for knee surgery. Nobody told me that I might be getting C. difficile while I was in there. So that was a complaint. And that's one of the biggest problems, that people don't know C. diff. So it's not if we had a cure for cancer, man, I'll tell you, there'd be a lot of people, a lot of publicity and a lot of press. Mind you, we'd probably be shot, because that's a $290 billion a year business that, that they'd like to keep going. So, but C. difficile is not well known. But so anyway, we decided it was a good starter gut bacterial infection. It's probably the most notable.
You want me to read this quickly about the C. difficile so people can know how prevalent it is?
Well, if you want, it's up to you. It's
C. difficile infections are a growing global crisis, with 500,000 cases annually in the U.S. alone, and that's from the CDC, and 29,000 deaths attributed to the pathogen each year. Mortality rates soar in severe cases, reaching 15 to 30% within 30 days of diagnosis, particularly among the elderly and the immunocompromised. Those are people often in the hospital. The economic burden is staggering, costing the U.S. healthcare system $6.3 billion yearly due to prolonged hospitalizations, treatments, and recurrences. Recurrence rates compound the crisis. 20 to 30% of patients relapse after initial antibiotic therapy, rising to 60% after multiple episodes. Hypervirulent strains are responsible for 20 to 30% of outbreaks. They drive higher mortality and resistance. Current treatments, including vancomycin, that's an antibiotic, which is 30% recurrence risk, fail to address microbiome disruption. So now it's going to cause dysbiosis, a root cause. With 1 in 11 seniors dying of C. diff within a month of diagnosis, 1 in 11 seniors within a month of diagnosis, innovative therapies to restore gut balance are critical to curbing this lethal, costly epidemic. So that gives you some understanding of C. diff.
Well, and one thing that people don't realize is that the main cause of C. difficile, the main treatment right now, the standard of care is an antibiotic, as in all bacterial treatments, that's what it is. The main cause of C. difficile, guess what, is an antibiotic. So in other words, you probably won't, I mean, you go out in the general population and you could pour C. diff all over them. If they've not had an antibiotic treatment previously within the last month, they wouldn't be susceptible. Their own gut microbiome is intact to the point where it'll fight off C. difficile. When you take that broad spectrum antibiotic treatment for, say, getting a tooth removed, now all of a sudden you're susceptible. And I can tell you a very sad story, and this is years ago, but it was a good friend of ours, a mother-in-law. She was on dialysis. She goes to her dentist, and the dentist says, and she was fine. I mean, dialysis is painful. I mean, you're going in 3 times a week to, do, blood, through the dialysis machines and stuff, but you're otherwise healthy as long as you do that. Anyway, so she goes to the dentist. The dentist says, I'm going to pull that tooth, but I want to give you this antibiotic so we don't get an infection. She didn't think anything of it. The doctor, as you mentioned, probably didn't even determine whether she was going to dialysis, whether or not he asked, I don't know. But funny enough, most dentists do ask, are you on other medications? Well, I don't know if you consider dialysis another medication, but regardless. So this lady, and she was probably my age at that time, takes the antibiotic. Now she goes to have dialysis, as she does routinely, in the hospital where C. diff is prevalent, picks up C. diff and was dead within a week. So, and she was otherwise healthy. And so it was kind of interesting because, I was talking about this research we're doing and mentioning C. difficile to the husband. It was the wife's mother that died, and she was we're at a little party, and she all of a sudden heard the word C. difficile because I was talking to her husband about it. Turned around and came right to me and said, "Did you say because it was on her death certificate? C. difficile was a contributing factor, but she was elderly, she was dialysis, so they don't really, say that it was necessarily C. diff. It was attributed to one of the reasons she died, but yeah, it's an unknown factor, unfortunately. But you do get it by taking an antibiotic, and so in our case, we've got a treatment that is working great, but it's got to go through the clinical trials, and that's very expensive. I mean, the clinical trials themselves, you do phase 1, 2, and 3, and then you can, apply to the FDA and get approval to sell the drug. Those trials are $10 million each typically, to get them done, if that's everything goes the way they should. So that's expensive to start with. They suggest that they're worrying about safety. Well, our treatment is actually egg powder. It's 100% whole egg powder. So if you have an egg allergy, that would be the one thing you might be concerned with. But what I understand from most people who have egg allergies, that's a rash or whatever it is. Most people who have C. diff, you could die. So, even with an egg allergy, you might say it's worth taking the treatment. If I get, a rash, I won't die. So, but regardless, matter of fact, even in our trial, if you want to be in the trial and you are allergic to eggs, you don't qualify for the trial. So that's, we don't need that in an actual trial situation. But so that's part of the problem, is trying to get the therapeutic done. And by the way, you talk about antimicrobial resistance. The treatments, when we started this, 10 or so years ago, there was a product called metronidazole. Flagyl was the name of the product, and that's an antibiotic. That was the standard of care for C. difficile. Now the standard of care is vancomycin. They don't prescribe Flagyl or metronidazole anymore because it doesn't work, and mainly because of resistance. So now you've got vancomycin, and you've also got another antibiotic called fidaxomicin. And by the way, that's it. Those two are all that's left to treat C. difficile with. And vancomycin will probably not long go the way of the metronidazole. It's probably not going to work that well either. And fidaxomicin would be the last one. And so we've come up with an antibody which is contrary to any knowledge. You think about a bacterial infection, right away you think antibiotic. That's just the treatment for bacterial infections. Well, guess what? There is an alternative, and we have it, which is oral dose antibodies that we can get from a chicken's egg, and you take it and it goes right to where the problem is and knocks it out. And the funny thing about when you talk about antibodies, we mentioned it with the COVID, people think of monoclonal antibodies, and monoclonal antibodies are the latest, sort of one of the latest treatments, and they're very, very expensive. The typical monoclonal antibody is now coming in at about 100 grand per patient per year. And again, it's an infusion. You go into the doctor for an hour, and the treatment. Matter of fact, there was a monoclonal antibody that was produced by Merck for C. diff, and it was originally intended to be a standard of care, in other words, get rid of the antibiotics. So, and it was $4,000 for so you'd go in and you'd take it, but their trials didn't show that it worked anywhere near as well as the antibiotics did. So what they did then, Merck decided, well, they spent a lot of money developing this monoclonal antibody. Let's put it as a preventing of recurrence. And you mentioned that in that thing you just read, recurrence is one of the biggest problems with C. diff. That bacteria, it actually is a spore forming bacteria. So you can get the antibiotic and knock out the bacteria, but this spore will lay dormant. So the bacteria is gone. You think you're better for a couple of weeks, and all of a sudden that spore germinates. The next thing you know, you've recurred. So in our case, we have antibodies against the spore as well. So in other words, we can knock out the bacteria, the spore, and by the way, they have two toxins, which are toxin A and toxin B. We take care of that as well. So it's by far a better treatment. Works so far we've done probably 130 patients so far. We're about 94% success. And the standard of care antibiotic right now are around 70. So,
94% success. That's huge.
That's where we're at. Yeah. And that's huge for any drug, for any treatment. So it's good.
So this is not really available for the general public. And
not yet, because we've got to go through these trials. And biggest problem with these trials, and here's part of the problem with the industry. I'm sure most people have seen the meme or the joke, a patient cured is a customer lost. And they think that's kind of funny. That's not funny. That's unbelievably true. A patient cured is a customer lost. We were talking about antimicrobial resistance before, and the fact that by 2050, the biggest killer of humans will be antimicrobial resistance. Like I said, you'll have a cut on your finger, go to the doctor, and he gives you 2 weeks to live. So that's a problem. But you don't see any large pharma companies developing new antibiotics because there's no money in it. It's just, and besides, the patient gets better after 10 to 14 days of the treatment. Even that fidaxomicin that we're talking about, which is the second standard of care for C. difficile, it's about $6,000. Very expensive. I mean, I had an ear infection. The last antibiotic I bought, I think it was $32. Very inexpensive. So to get away with $6,000 for an antibiotic treatment is, stretching it. But and I don't blame the big pharma companies for not doing it. How much can you charge to cure somebody from a bacterial infection? Well, if that bacterial infection is going to kill them, you could probably charge them 100 grand and they'd be happy to pay it, but we're just not used to that. We're used to cheap antibiotics. And so you sort of think, well, how can you get around the problem, the incentivization for big pharma to develop these new treatments? There's all kinds of, bureaucratic discussions about we need to do something about AMR, antimicrobial resistance, but it's just talk, because it comes right down to the actual pharma company. They just look at it as a business decision. I can invest in this, or this. I can make money on these ones. I'm not going to make money on that. It's going to, save mankind, but there's no money in saving mankind if I don't get paid for it. And so it's just a business decision for them. And I'm not criticizing them. That's what any business does. I don't care what business you're in, making, whatever.
But that's one of the things that's the problem with the world.
A patient, you always wary, because the incentives for healthcare versus the incentives for a patient are very different. And so, but and C. diff's a good example. So now they're not
Okay,
looking
I
for.
want to ask you something about the work that you're doing. Do you need any help? Do you need any help from people? I mean, you right now, people are going to be watching this. Is there something you need that you'd like to ask for?
But we thought about, financing is our biggest problem right now. Our trials are stalled because we don't have the money to continue, recruiting patients, and it's expensive just to recruit one patient and treat them. Forget about the value of the treatment, is probably $10,000 per patient. That's to pay the hospitals, the doctor that's going to do the work, and so it's expensive. So obviously we need help there. And I thought, if it was something that was well known to the public, in other words, people were afraid of it, you could do crowdfunding almost, in other words, let's invest in this because it's going to help us in the future. But unfortunately, it's not known. And by the way, if I started doing that, I know that you think about the people who talked about ivermectin during COVID, they got completely suppressed because it's not good for business,
Right,
So,
right. So if it's something that could affect the competition, what they perceive as the competition, they could just shut you down.
well, and just make it, the typical biotech company, which we are theoretically, the whole idea is to get through phase 2 clinical trials, and then big pharma looks at you and buys you out, because then they take it forward from there. We haven't, and we've already had enough data, more than you normally even get in a phase 2 clinical trial, to show that we're doing this 94%. We don't have anybody jumping on us, to try to, take us over, buy us out, or anything like that, because it's not in their business plan. So, and even worse than that now. Okay, so we talked about the therapeutic side, in other words, curing C. diff. And there's only 2 treatments right now, antibiotics. Okay. We thought, okay, wouldn't it be better if you could prevent it altogether? So, and I related to the shingles vaccine. So, and I mentioned earlier that both Pfizer and Sanofi, Pasteur, big, pharma companies, tried to come up with vaccines for C. diff, and they didn't work. The logic there from a financial point of view is you could now everybody would know about C. diff, because they would scare the crap out of you, and you would know that C. diff was a dangerous thing, so you'd go out and get your C. diff vaccine, much like shingles. Okay, shingles and C. diff aren't much different in the fact, well, they are. Shingles infects 1 million people a year, not many. C. diff is only 500,000 in the United States, so not much different in how many people it infects. Shingles doesn't usually kill anybody. I mean, it's a painful infection, there's no question, but C. diff got a 6% mortality rate, so way more likely to kill you than shingles ever would. So, but everybody knows about shingles because now there's a vaccine. There's you can monetize getting people scared to go out and get their shingles vaccine. If we could monetize people to be afraid of C. diff, that would be great. Here's another problem now, and I'm not going to mention any names, but the industry causes C. diff. First of all, you take an antibiotic that makes you susceptible. Okay, you took the antibiotic because you're getting knee surgery. That made you susceptible. Now you get C. diff. You need a cure, you go to the antibiotic or our stuff. That's good. So I thought, wouldn't it be great if you could actually prevent? And like I said, we've already seen that a couple of big pharma companies thought that was a good idea. Didn't make it work, unfortunately. But we could take a combination of our antibodies and literally give it to susceptible patients. And first of all, let's think about it. It's not like a vaccine, you give it to everybody, okay? Because if you can scare everybody about shingles, the whole world is a potential customer. With C. diff, if you don't take an antibiotic, your likelihood of getting C. diff is minimal. In other words, if you don't upset that gut flora, C. diff is caused by really antibiotics and proton pump inhibitors. In other words, acid reflux inhibitors. Those are the 2 things that set your gut microbiome in dysbiosis to the point where you're now susceptible. So we can weed down the number of people that even need to be treated with a preventive, okay? Because it's only, hospital would be 1, over 65 would be another. So those 3 criteria, taking an antibiotic, in a hospital, and over 65, those people should take our treatment. Okay, that would be a great thing. Now I'm talking to the industry generally, about this idea. And I'm thinking, that patient went into the hospital for knee surgery and got C. diff. Somebody has to pay for that. I mean, the patient shouldn't have to pay for it because he's paying for the knee surgery, not for the, recovering of the C. diff. But yeah, somebody does pay for it. It's typically insurance or whatever. But what happens is that patient is now in the hospital for an extra 6 or 7 days while he tries to recover, if he does at all, because he could certainly die. And that's revenue to the hospital. And I'm thinking, so in other words, you would take the revenue over preventing the patient from getting sick. And they say basically, yeah, that's how we make money, is by having people in the hospital. And that was sort of enough. I lost it at that point, and I just thought this is absolutely pathetic. And the only thing with C. diff is kind of interesting, and I don't want to go this.
Were you talking to the Canadian
No,
healthcare industry or the American?
Canadian's different. The Canadian's different.
Was that an American?
Yes, it was American, because that's it. They're incentivized to make money. So
Right.
a patient in the hospital for an extra 7 days is revenue positive. Somebody has to pay for it, but eventually it comes back to insurance. And if it comes back to the taxpayer eventually.
It comes back to the taxpayer.
Well, think about it, because most of those patients are 65 plus, so they're on Medicare anyway.
Right.
So it's being paid for by the taxpayer. So it's a great general revenue for the hospital itself, which, the poor patient who could have been prevented. And let's face it, you're in that hospital for something that's making you sick. Otherwise, you get C. diff on top of it, you want to die. I'm telling you, because that's the worst. People don't realize how bad C. diff is. You just go online and ask, see some of the horror stories of people with C. diff and how it can recur and such. So it's not something you want to get, especially if you're in the hospital trying to recover from something else. But preventing it, that's complicated. And that was the word that was used, by the way. And I'm thinking, my God. So now, how do you incentivize patients? Well, you got to do an advertising campaign. People don't know about C. diff to begin with. We could do a shingles campaign to scare the crap people. By the way, scare the crap, that's no pun intended, because that's what happens is, it's profuse diarrhea when you get C. difficile. And that's, the marketing campaign. But I'm thinking, okay, and it's very only specific patients. Like I said, those 3 categories should be taking some kind of preventive measure. But the industry doesn't really want it. So I don't know, that it just sort of frustrates the heck out of me. And, which is too bad, because, we have a great product, which is it should be the standard of care right now. I mean, we're even to the point of saying, okay, for all of our treatments, there's 3 things that affect you with C. diff: the initial infection, okay, and then you get, I'm just going to plug in because I'm getting a lower power mode here, but you get the initial infection, which can cause problems, and then you can get the recurrent infection that we talked about, and then the other treatment would be the preventive. So there's 3 different potential treatments. And what I've thought, okay, I'm not adverse to the fact that on the prevention, let's start with that. You take our preventive treatment, I don't know, say it's going to cost $400. I don't know what it would be, but roughly. And I will go as far as saying, and if you get C. diff, we'll give you your money back. I challenge any other pharma company to ever come up with that. Now, to the next one, recurrent C. diff. And I'm almost positive we haven't had any recurrence from our initial treatments at all. So I'm sure that our treatment would prevent recurrence. So in other words, you could take the antibiotic treatment along with our treatment, and prevent. And if you got it, we'll give you your money back. And lastly, on the therapeutic, in other words, as a standard of care, you could take our treatment, and if it doesn't work, and it's either works or it doesn't work, you're going to get better or you're not going to get better. If it doesn't work, I'll give you your money back again. So in all 3 instances of treatments we could have, we'd be more than happy to give your money back. Oh, would that set a precedent for pharma? I think that would be a disaster. Has anything else you buy a car, if it doesn't work, you take it back. You buy anything, but medications, So those are things that frustrate me. I was never in this business. I got into it by accident, and what I've learned is pretty incredible. That's how the industry works, and it's a shame, because, and again, I don't blame any corporation in any business for trying to make money, and pharma's no different. It's just that the incentives are working.
The way they're trying to make money is not very nice. I mean,
well, but listen, you take whatever business you're going to go into, you decide to be, in the pharma business, that's what you're going to do, is try to make money. So I don't really blame them. I just think there's got to be
there is a way to do the business and try to help people at the same time. There is a way to do that, but that's not what they're doing. But let's, so anyway, and we know that the United States pays more for pharmaceuticals than any other developed country. It may be 70% more. I know that when I was in Italy and I had to get a prescription for something, and my prescription was for one round for I think 14 days or something, or 7 days, I can't remember, but it was $14. And I came back to the United States because I needed to take another round of it, and it was almost $300. It was the same brand, everything was the same.
Yeah.
And I used to, years ago, when I was in my 20s, I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, which I completely got rid of doing a whole food plant-based diet and getting some stress out of my life. But I was on lithium, and I was on lithium for quite a while. I used to go down to Mexico and buy a whole bunch of lithium. I could just buy it over the counter, and it was just nothing. I mean, it wasn't even expensive in the States, but when I was down in Mexico, I would just get a bunch of it because it was, I don't know, maybe $1 for a month's supply or something. But pharmaceuticals are so much cheaper in other countries.
Well, it's not just that. It's there's no question for a pharma company, the holy grail is the U.S. Absolutely no question about it. As a matter of fact, one of the biggest and fastest growing medications and companies is Novo Nordisk out of Denmark. They sell the GLP-1 inhibitor, the Wegovy, the fat
Right,
the fat drugs, as Trump calls them. Anyway, and so I don't even think they sell that drug in Denmark. They sell it huge in North America, but even that, I think it's between $1,000 and $1,500 a month in the U.S. Here in Canada, $200 or $300. So
let me tell you something about that. How because the pharmaceutical reps come in and they teach the doctors what to say and all this. And I was working with a fellow that had type 2 diabetes and high blood pressure, and he went on a whole food plant-based diet, and he was losing weight. His blood sugar came way down. Everything, all his numbers were coming way down. So he goes to the doctor, excited that the doctor is going to, be really happy for him. And the doctor was. He said, "Oh, that's great. You're doing well." He said, "Well, but I've got a drug for you that I want you to take you'll lose the rest of the weight faster, and it'll bring your blood sugar down faster." And it was one of those drugs. And I said, no, do not take that. Whatever you do, don't take that. So here's a guy that's already having success with diet, quick success.
Yeah.
And the doctor is trying to get him to take that drug.
Well, no, the whole thing is it's an industry that makes money, and that's how it makes money. It doesn't make money without patients. And so if you go on a plant-based diet, there's no revenue to the healthcare industry in that regard. So
there's no big broccoli.
Yeah, no. So anyway, but yeah.
Okay, well, let's talk about because now we're going to go into your product that is available and kind of what it can do anecdotally.
Yeah.
So let's define gut dysbiosis before we go into that, because that's what this helps with. And is a gut dysbiosis, but that was just one.
And dysbiosis typically is when bad bugs outgrow good bugs. And first of all, to think about your gut microbiome, it's hard to imagine, but in that little space, which is probably, it might be 3 to 4 pounds worth of literally poop in your gut. So it's a fixed space. You don't have much room. There are between 40 and 100 trillion different bugs, mostly bacteria, but there's other things like viruses and archaea and a bunch of different types of things, but mostly bacteria. And they work together. They're like, think about it. If it's 100 trillion, it's hard for people to even imagine 100 trillion. And there's probably between 1,000 and 3,000 different species of bacteria in there. So 1,000 to 3,000 divided into 100 trillion means like there's lots and lots of bugs that are different species, all living. I sort of relate it to, remember the Star Wars bar in the movie Star Wars?
Yes, yeah, I remember that.
That's your gut microbiome, and they look like those guys. They probably do under a microscope. That's what it is. And you know what? When there's no bad guys in the bar and everybody's having fun, everything works well. They all get along great. You remember the Star Wars bar? Everything's great. All of a sudden you bring in some asshole from the whatever galaxy, and there goes the whole, the mood's gone. And, now there people are fighting and everything. And that's really a good analogy as to the gut microbiome. So the bad guys will overtake. And one of the main causes of that, typically, even with the C. difficile one, is you need a disruption to get out of balance. Okay. So, and they use the numbers 80-20. So 80 good, 20% bad. Whether that's close, who knows? And by the way, it's different for everybody. There's no, everybody's microbiome, microbiome's like your fingerprint. There's no two microbiomes that'll ever be the same. And by the way, they change constantly. So your fingerprint today would be different from tomorrow, what's in there based on what you eat and what you're subjected to environmentally and all the rest. But one of the biggest disruptors of your gut microbiome is an antibiotic, because it goes in and knocks out your whole gut flora. And that's, by the way, like I said, what makes you susceptible to that bacterial infection called C. difficile. So, but there's other ongoing dysbiosis happening on a regular basis. You don't even notice it. And that's, I'll go back to my animal agriculture. I would say to these farmers, they would say, okay, look, I have no diarrhea. I don't have any E. coli. I said, well, okay, just try my product. This is the E. coli antibody. And what they're looking for is growth, remember? So they're telling me they have no E. coli because they don't see any diarrhea. And I'm saying, well, I'll make you a bet. If you take my product, you're going to see an improvement of the performance of your animals, because you do have E. coli. And once you knock that down, they're going to grow faster because they can eat, they can digest better. The E. coli is causing dysbiosis.
Absolutely. That's exactly what happens to us.
And by the way, that guy who said miracle after we brought his baby pig death rate down from 6%, exactly what happened. There was no diarrhea. It's just that there's enough E. coli inside that's causing problems you might not even know about. And so that's,
and it's one of the things I've noticed with myself. It's the inflammation. Even when you have inflammation, that you can't eat as much.
Yeah.
It affects how much you can eat. But once you bring that inflammation down, all of a sudden, it's like this food tastes really good, and then you can eat.
Well, and inflammation is what you think about. Inflammation is typically caused by an immune reaction. In other words, you think about it, you cut your finger and all of a sudden it swells up. And that's because, you've got an immune reaction that your antibodies go to that location and it swells. And that's basically the inflammation causing that reaction. It goes away, which is the idea of how an immune reaction is supposed to work. But you can have gut dysbiosis, which is ongoing continually. You've got inflammation in your gut on a regular basis. And so what our E. coli antibody does is it basically keeps that overgrowth of bad bugs in check. And so one of the things I've looked at for the past 15 years or more is I've looked at human research as relates to the gut microbiome. In other words, when I was talking about it earlier, Google asthma with gut dysbiosis or gut microbiome, and you're going to find research on it. And what they come up with in the research, the only two answers they get is, we see in a healthy patient that doesn't have asthma, high diversity. In other words, out of those 1,000 to 3,000 different species of bugs, there's more of them. There's 3,000 species. And we see low bad bug overgrowth. In unhealthy people, we see high bad bug overgrowth and low diversity. Well, you think about it, in a closed system, they have to be the same. In other words, high bad bug overgrowth means there's no room for diversity.
Right.
So your diversity goes down. And diversity is good. Probiotics is the idea about trying to increase, diversity. Whether it works or not is another story. Our whole thing is, we now call it, instead of we call it Meggabiotics, which is just a name we've invented ourselves. But basically, it's microbiome egg antibody therapy. So in other words, it's a biotic because it's doing something the way an antibiotic does or a probiotic is supposed to. But it's, instead of adding good bugs, we're keeping the bad guys in check to the point where the good guys can regenerate on their own, which they will. If the environment's healthy, we'll all do better on our own. We don't need, being propped up with anything. So that's what our whole thing is to keep the bad bugs in check. And an interesting, story on that, the guy who is our chief clinical investigator for our phase 2 clinical trial on our C. difficile treatment, I was out meeting with him in the hospital. It's in the Foothills Hospital in Calgary, biggest hospital in Calgary in Western Canada. And I'm telling this story basically as I've been telling you about how we got started with the E. coli antibodies and everything else. And the doctors there are listening as I'm telling the story to an actual C. diff patient who I was trying to encourage to get into our we hadn't even had the trial started yet, but that she could take our product, as a you're a clinician is allowed to give something, if he thinks that the patient needs it because nothing else is working for her. So anyway, so now I'm telling her about the E. coli antibody. He says, "You have an E. coli antibody?" He didn't know. He knows that he's working with us on the C. difficile antibody. And I said, yeah, we do. And I said, we've used it. And we've got it registered as a veterinary biologic for baby pigs, and this is, on the human side, it can be used that way as well. And he said, and I sort of asked him, well, why are you curious about the E. coli? He says, well, I've been doing, and he's the fecal transplant guy. So he's our clinical trial guy, but he's also the fecal transplant guy for Western Canada. In other words, if you get C. diff that's not being cured by those two antibiotics, the vancomycin and fidaxomicin, your last hope is this fecal transplant. So they'll give the poop from a healthy donor to the multiple recurrent C. difficile patient, and it works pretty well, which is great. But what he does, so we call him the poop doctor. He's got a lab where he literally analyzes, much like Dr. Hazen does. As a matter of fact, they both do the same thing. They both do fecal transplants. So, and she mentioned the other day that she knows this doctor out in Calgary as well.
Right,
but what he's done just on his own, because he's got his own lab, he does a coliform count, which is basically measuring the E. coli levels in the stool of the patient, any patient that he sees, regardless of what infection or disease they've got. And he came up with just his own observational sort of parameter. If you're over 1 million colony forming units per milliliter of stool, you're sick. I don't know what you're sick with necessarily, but normally there's something wrong with you. If you're under that, you're probably okay. So in other words, now that he's interested in the fact that, wow, you have an E. coli antibody. In other words, so we don't know what's causation. You might be sick, and that's what's causing the overgrowth of the E. coli, or the overgrowth of the E. coli might be what's causing you to be sick. So let's just say it's the second one. If we can keep that E. coli down, then maybe whatever was causing that chronic disease, typically inflammation, goes away. And we've seen that with many people. As a matter of fact, we did one patient, we did a before and after. So she was going in, she was going to take our E. coli antibody, our gut fix product. And I said, do me a favor. You're out in Calgary anyway. Take a stool sample in before, take our treatment for a month, and see what your stool sample is after. And she did it, which was great, and so she was 2 million CFUs to start. And I always use the pun, we dropped her a log, because we're talking poop anyway. But so she went from 2 million to 200,000 CFUs.
Wow.
And so my doctor out there called me and said, that's significant. That's pretty incredible. So, now if we can correlate that to the fact that she got better, and we didn't go on further with her situation, but there's no question that if a high coliform count correlates with ill health, and a high bad bacteria count means lower diversity, wouldn't it hold that if you could get that coliform count down with an antibody that we can give on a daily basis, that your good bacteria will grow again on its own, and that chronic disease that you had may go away? And we've seen that. People, you can ask AI, is asthma curable? And it will say no, but you can treat the symptoms, because that's what it knows. Well, I've had at least a half a dozen severe asthmatics completely cured of any symptoms whatsoever. So in my own case, arthritis. Now, arthritis is an inflammation in the joints, and there's all kinds of explanations as to why. They think it could be, bits of bacteria that
Right.
They go through the leaky gut and then
Right.
lodge in your joints, and now you get an immune reaction. So you get inflammation in those joints, which causes pain. And I had major pain. I had knees and shoulders that, there was nothing that I couldn't sleep. There was no comfortable position. So I started taking my antibody, and I wasn't taking it. This is 9 years ago, before we knew anything about it. We knew that it would do well from, you go to Mexico, we could take care of it because it's the same E. coli that causes Montezuma's revenge. We'll fix that, easily in 1 hour. And I've had hundreds of patients that have done that and got those results. A lot of money to try to prove it again, to be able to make that actual claim. But in my case, I was taking it because, okay, if we're going to sell this product as a gut health product, what if somebody takes it every day? Because I was originally only thinking they'd take it when they had Montezuma's or, food
Yes.
poisoning in third world countries. And so I'm taking it every day, and I just got in for an MRI on my right shoulder, which I've separated 3 times. Played rugby for 39 years, so I broke everything. But anyway, so I get a call back after the MRI, severe osteoarthritis in your right shoulder. Well, I knew that. My range of motion was that. I couldn't raise my arm any higher than that. So I'm taking this stuff, and before I'm going in, and you need the MRI before you can go see the surgeon, because we're talking potentially, some kind of operation to fix whatever's broken, mussed up in there. And so after about 4 weeks of taking this every day, only to see if there's any negative reactions to it because of the people that I might sell to that were taking it for traveler's diarrhea. I wake up one morning and I get out of bed, which normally is painful, nothing. And my knees don't hurt, my shoulders don't hurt. I can raise my arm like that. I'm thinking, whoa, what the hell's happened? Now I'm starting to do some research on why would an antibody against E. coli have anything to do with inflammation in my shoulder, my knees, and so that got it started. I did a lot of research then saying, is there a correlation? And there definitely has been lots of research showing inflammation in the gut can relate to inflammation in your joints. How we got the asthma thing going was the girl who makes that antibody in our lab, makes that vaccine. She had acid reflux, severe. She was on a proton pump inhibitor for many years. You're not supposed to be on that drug for more than a couple of months because it's bad for your bone health and things like that. And so anyway, she'd been on that for a long time. I said, look, try this and just see. I know it's gut related. You got acid reflux, has to be something to do with the gut. 3 or 4 weeks later, she comes back, absolutely perfect. No acid reflux whatsoever. Keep taking it. I'm giving it to her, so it's no big deal. It doesn't cost her anything. I said, keep taking it because we don't know what's causing the acid reflux. Obviously, if this is working for her, keep taking it. I knew she was asthmatic, but I didn't think about it. That wasn't even a thought in my head. About 3 weeks later, comes back, her asthma completely gone. Absolutely. And she was severe asthmatic. The 2 other people in the lab that work with her, every time she'd take her puffer, it was a heavy duty stimulant. She'd literally almost pass out because, her heart would get going too fast. It's, a steroid. And anyway, she's been off that drug now for about 6 or 7 years. Both those drugs, we got her doctor, I'm sure not really very willingly, to write a letter saying that he hasn't prescribed either of those drugs for her now. Well, now that letter goes back 6 or 7 years. So we have some anecdotal evidence that inflammation in the gut can lead to inflammation in a whole lot of other places. And I keep going back to the argument that if dysbiosis and Hippocrates were right, if all disease begins in the gut and it's caused by inflammation or overgrowth of bad bugs, if you can keep that bad bug thing in check, then maybe you have a chance of solving a lot of these things. And also, forget about just solving things that are chronic illnesses we have now. What are we potentially preventing? I mean, they say that colorectal cancer has a lot to do with potential E. coli association. We don't what that association is, but my thoughts are is if you can keep that E. coli in check, well, it probably lessens your chance if there's an association.
Absolutely.
And then things like UTI, urinary tract infections, okay, affect women way more than men. Typically 90% plus caused by E. coli. So my thoughts are is that, okay, if you can get that E. coli level down, then the UTI should diminish. And some women, UTIs are ongoing. I mean, they say, I think
sometimes it's the beginning of the end for them, older women.
Well, sure. But they also say that I think 50% of all women at one time in their life have a UTI. So
yeah, I've had a couple, 2 or 3.
Yeah, well, there you go. But to some people, it's chronic. And so my thought is if you're taking that antibody, and it's a relatively inexpensive daily thing, and the whole idea is you do it because you want to suppress that.
Well, and also that friend of mine, Deborah, that we said and she had the E. coli, and she got E. coli. She started off with a UTI, and they gave her an antibiotic. She didn't go to the hospital or anything. They gave her an antibiotic, and then she got not E. coli, she got C. diff.
From the antibiotic for the CD for the.
And they took antibiotics for the C. diff, and then it started coming back again, and that's when I told her about John, and John you just sent her
just the E. coli antibody.
E. coli antibodies. And so she went on a second round of antibiotics, and she took the E. coli antibodies, and the C. diff never returned.
No, and that's actually the second patient we've had that's taken the E. coli antibody that's gotten rid of C. diff, which is sort of not the way it's supposed to work. But listen, if it works, great. And
whatever the chicken, I mean, it's not just what the chicken's been vaccinated with, right? It's whatever the chicken has antibodies against. Maybe
yeah.
it has antibodies against C. diff.
Well, and really, we only get when we say we're doing an E. coli antibody, there's about 150 milligrams of immunoglobulin or antibodies in each egg. Okay, so we get out of that egg, out of that immunoglobulin portion when we do the vaccination, we probably get 15 to 20% of it being specific to E. coli. So in other words, 80% of it is whatever that bird's been,
Right.
by during their lifetime. And so, and even just in the environment itself. And C. diff is definitely in the soil and it's everywhere, so it's, there's no question they could be getting antibodies against it for sure. So anyway, the gut
Well,
fix product,
well,
GUTFY.
let's tell them about, oh yeah, you're getting ready to do that. Because I would just want to say,
Yeah.
people, this is a product you can purchase. There have
Yeah.
been no clinical trials, but it's completely safe. If you can eat eggs, you can take this because it's just eggs.
Yeah.
And so John's going to tell you how you can get it. And so
Yeah, you can go to our website, and that's GUTFYX, and we use fix. I mean, it sounds like fix, and we're trying to fix people, but there's some logic behind the FYX. It's a food. It's whole egg powder, so it's a food to begin with. The Y is the symbol for antibodies. Antibodies are large Y-shaped proteins that your immune system produces to identify and neutralize pathogens. And so that's what the Y stands for. And X, it's targeted. So X is a target, basically. You're throwing a dart at an X. So it's an antibody, a targeted antibody that's food based. And so, but it also says fix, and that's what we're trying to do to you, is fix you. And we like to say we like to fix people while they max profits. So it's we like to make some money if we could as well. But I must admit, I'm probably the worst salesman when it comes to somebody's health. I know it works great. I mean, unbelievable for me. I get out of my car and it's a laugh. I every time I do, I say, boy, that was easy, which it was always painful. For the last 10 years have been painful. Well, not the last 10 years because I've gotten over it, but 10 years prior to that. And so, but I take it every day and have done for now. But yeah,
what did your second MRI show when you were no longer in pain?
I never went back for one.
Oh, you never, because you didn't have to.
No. Well, that's the other problem with our healthcare system. It takes a long time to get an MRI.
Well, it does here too.
Yeah.
So that's you've given the website, and there's all the information is on the website, and there's also informative educational information on there.
Yeah.
Are there some podcasts on there, or?
Well, we've got different videos that we're doing on a regular basis. Okay. So it's not a whole lot, but we've actually interviewed the one or two of the asthma patients and the acid reflux patients and stuff like that. And so it's a hard thing for people to get their head around, is that why am I, and one of the biggest problems we've had, somebody will take it and they'll take, a couple of days, and then they'll miss a couple of days, and they'll take a couple more days after. And, and it's not going to work that way. And they say, well, I tried it, but it didn't work. And it doesn't work immediately anyway. If you've got a chronic ailment, how long did it take you to get that chronic ailment? You got asthma at 16, so you were probably getting it for the last 10 years before that. Right. So if we can get rid of it in a month, that's pretty good.
That's all amazing. Okay. Well, John, this has been wonderful having you on this podcast. It's amazing what you've been talking about. The innovators that I have on this that people don't know about, I call them unsung heroes, because people don't know about them, and I'm trying to help people to know about you all, because your message and what you all have developed is so important, and people are kind of held captive by our current medical system. So I'm just trying to show people another way. And I
certainly appreciate that. And there's no question, we've been at this now for 25 plus years, and it's been very frustrating in the fact that it's not the typical. I mean, there's lots of supplements out there, and I don't mind being called a supplement, but I think we're beyond that. That's why we came up with our
you're a medical food.
Well, even that, there's a different definition of a medical food, which we don't fit that either. We actually are, and based on our C. diff treatment, we're an actual drug, okay, but not the same connotations of the drug. Drugs are typically biochemical Ours is actually, it is a food, there's no question, but the food contains the antibodies. The antibodies are the most natural way of healing us since mankind evolved. Not just mankind, any species that has an immune system, that's how they survive. So we're just taking that, which sounds like it's natural, and it is natural, but it's not like a regular vitamin supplement or anything like that. And I'm not, besmirching any of those other supplements. They're certainly not the same. Ours is an actual. We go through a real rigorous procedure to get where we're at. In other words, we're regulated. Our vaccine production is regulated the same as any other vaccine production. More so, by the way. I told you, 4 years for us to get approval versus 9 months to get approval for the COVID vaccine.
Right. Yeah.
So we're regulated completely in that regard, and it's treated as a drug. The C. difficile treatment, 100% the same as vancomycin or fidaxomicin, except it's not an antibiotic; it's an antibody, and no side effects virtually, except for potentially the egg allergy. So it's something that's been hard to get people to understand. Meggabiotics with 2 G's, microbiome egg antibody therapy. So we needed to come up with something, so I don't have to keep going through the explanation every single time as to what it is. But
we're gonna have to stop now because it's gonna get too long.
yeah, no question.
So I just want to say, if there's anybody watching this that wants to get involved and wants to help John finish the clinical trials for the C. diff, and it maybe even wants to get involved with the gut fix, you've got his website. It's gutfyx.com, and you can get in touch with him there. And I thank you so much, John, for being on here. It's just an honor to have had you come on. And I thank you all for watching.
Robin, I appreciate inviting me on, and let's hope this podcast and all your ones going forward, do bring forward some of this new innovations that are happening, and people need to know these things. So, thanks again.
Thank you. Be well.
You too.
Thank you. Bye-bye.